In the previous lecture, we looked at some examples of Roman technology and mentioned in passing the Romans' relative lack of interest in Greek natural philosophy. In this lecture, I want to expand on the idea of Rome's response to Greek natural philosophy because they didn't just simply disregard it, they altered it, took from it selectively for whatever suited their purposes. What was the Roman response, and what forms did it take to Greek natural philosophy? Well, I think first, a good example to begin with is one that illustrates the Romans' recognition of the superiority, the talent of the Greeks in scientific topics. And the specific topic also underscores the Romans' interest in practical applications as well. The example I want to use is the reform of the calendar in the 1st century BC at the urging of Julius Caesar. Now, to reform the calendar, Caesar did what in modern business speak is called outsourcing. He turned to the experts. Where were the experts? In the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean, Alexandria. He engaged an Alexandrian astronomer by the name of Sosigenes to develop a calendar for the Roman Empire. Now, before I go any further, some of you may be saying, what's the big deal about the calendar? Well, we live in an age where we get calendars given to us. They come in the mail with advertising on them. They're such a common part of our daily life, we take them totally for granted. But the calendar incorporates a great deal of sophisticated astronomical observation, of timekeeping, all kinds of calculations, far into the future and into the past. The concerns over the calendar recur almost every century of the times that we're looking at. In many centuries, people didn't know what to do to reform the calendar. This is a time in which people did know what to do. By asking Sosigenes the Alexandrian, the Romans developed, or Sosigenes developed for them, what came to be called, in honor of Julius Caesar, the Julian calendar. Why is the calendar so important? Well, our lives are tied to astronomical events. Particularly, if you're an agricultural society, you have to know when to plant and when to harvest. The entire culture, particularly ours now that calendars are so widespread, is governed by the days of the week and the months of the year. So a calendar is an incredibly important way of crystallizing social structures in a society. Also, maintaining the success of agriculture and other affairs. Banking, the list just goes on. Without a calendar, without time reckoning, a lot of the accoutrements of civilized society become impossible, or at least very complicated. Well, remember, in the second lecture, I mentioned that one of the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians' contributions to the modern world is the calendar. And in fact, it is. Our modern calendar ultimately derives from the ancient Egyptian. For Sosigenes presented the Romans with an improved version of the old Egyptian calendar. His calendar required the determination of the exact length of the solar year. Well, what does the exact length of the solar year actually mean? That means the time it takes for the sun to move through the zodiac and make exactly one circuit. How long does it take for the sun to go from position A all the way around the zodiac exactly back to that position? That's what we define as a solar year. Sosigenes determined this at 365 days and 1 quarter. Therefore, he suggested that the Romans use a 4-year cycle of calendar. A year would be composed of 365 days. No 5 holidays, extra calendrical days the way the ancient Egyptians did. 365 counted days. They were to be divided up into 12 months, alternating in length between 30 and 31 days. Every 4th year, however, an extra day would be inserted into the month of February. Not at the end, the way we do. In the middle of the last week of February is where the Romans did it initially. The leap year. So, in other words, 365 days. For 3 years, that quarter of a day would add up. At the end of a 4th year, it would add up to a whole day. and that got stuck into February. Well, after Sosigenes came up with this idea, it had to be implemented. Well, unfortunately, the previous calendar of the Romans was so inaccurate, so sloppy, that it took a great deal of drastic action to get the Julian calendar started. Let me just give you an example. Have you ever noticed, if you know a little bit of Latin, the names of our months don't seem to be right? September, October, November, December. Well, those are the roots at the beginning: sept, 7, oct, 8, 9, 10. But they're not the 7th through 10th month. They're the 9th through the 12th. Well, in the original Roman calendar, they were, in fact, the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th month, because the old Roman calendar only had 10 months. The Romans, in their very early days, didn't even seem to have bothered to have counted winter days when agriculture was impossible. The calendar started up again in the spring. Well, they didn't always start it up at the right time, so errors accumulated there. Moreover, I should mention, just in passing, that the months we call July and August were originally called Quintilis and Sextilis, the 5th and 6th months. Where do the current names come from? Well, they're named after the Roman emperors, Julius and Augustus Caesar. The old Roman calendar was sufficiently far off that in order to get the vernal equinox, that is the first day of spring, to fall on the 25th of March, which is the way they wanted it, an edict had to be passed to make the year that we call 44 BC longer. In fact, the year that we call 44 BC, the year of Caesar's murder, was 445 days long. That returned the first day of spring to the 25th of March. The regulation of the Julian calendar was given over as the duty of the Roman priests. Now, you will notice that calendrical work and the priesthood go together in society after society. The Babylonian priests took care of announcing when a new moon had been sighted, and therefore a new month was starting. The Egyptian priests kept their calendar functioning. The Roman priests kept their calendar functioning. Actually, they didn't do a tremendously good job of it because they were confused about how to count leap years, when to start adding them. They added too many, and so the Julian calendar had to be amended yet again. They got it right finally in 4 BC, and the Julian calendar then functioned for 1600 years. But after the collapse of the Roman Empire, who do you think took care of the calendar? Christian priests were the ones that marked the time and the passage of the years. Well, was everything fine then after 4 BC with the Julian calendar functioning? Well, Sosigenes' estimate or calculation, observation of the length of the solar year was pretty good. It was off by only 11 minutes. And you say 11 minutes in 365 days. That's not bad. Well, no, it's not bad relatively speaking, except over time, if you expect the calendar to function for century after century, the error adds up. And so finally, in the 16th century, the calendar had to be revised yet again to the one we use, the Gregorian calendar, named after Pope Gregory the 13th. Again, it's the priesthood taking care of the calendar. All right, well, what about the attitude of the wider Roman culture towards Greek natural philosophy? Well, it's fairly well known that the Roman leisured class, and the leisured class expanded enormously owing to the wealth flowing into the Roman Empire, the Roman leisured class had an interest in Greek learning and culture. The Roman poet Horace, for example, wrote in one of his epistles a line that's become famous, which reads, "Captive Greece," that is captured by the Romans, "captive Greece captured the rude victor and introduced the arts to rustic Latium," that is the land of the Latins. Well, this taste for Greek culture also extended to Greek natural philosophy. It was fashionable to know something about Greek natural philosophy, Greek scientific topics. But the fact that the cause of the interest was fashionability among the leisured classes had two opposite effects. On the one hand, it increased the readership. More people were reading texts dealing with Greek natural philosophy, more than would have done in the Greek world, simply because there was a social pressure to do so. But because it was a leisure time pursuit and more a matter of taste and good breeding, rather than, say, an Aristotelian desire to know, the Romans didn't sweat a great deal over it. And so they developed popularized versions. The audience operated at a rather low level. Now, since I said the Romans didn't sweat over it, in some sense that's wrong, because I have to point out that one of the places where the Romans did this study of Greek natural philosophy was, in fact, their baths. The Roman baths were cultural, educational, entertainment centers. They were the one-stop shopping for entertainment and leisure time in the Roman world. Combination of athletic center and social club, country club, all rolled into one. The Roman baths were huge. We forget how big they were. Caracalla's baths in the 3rd century AD covered about 25 acres. It was a huge complex. It included, in fact, 2 libraries. That's where libraries were located in the Roman world. You would relax in your 3 temperatures of bath, then come out of the bath and spend some time reading, perhaps. Diocletian's baths could serve over 3,000 people at the same time. So this was a big complex, and that's where a lot of this reading went on. Well, what are some examples of the popularized Roman versions of Greek natural philosophy? Well, one is the poem written by the Roman Lucretius. It's called De Rerum Natura, on natural things, or I'm sorry, on the nature of things. It was a popularization in verse of Epicurean atomic theory. Now, wait, you say, I'm here, a leisured Roman, after my bath. Why am I reading about atomic theory? That doesn't exactly sound like leisure time reading. Well, in fact, remember that the atomic notions of Epicurus were tightly bound in with his moral and ethical precepts, his moral and ethical philosophy. His philosophy that I've called previously the don't worry, be happy philosophy. Everything in the world happens on account of random collisions of atoms, so don't worry about fortune or placating any gods, just live your life. That's something that appealed to certain classes of Romans, and Lucretius's poem was apparently fairly widely read. If we go to astronomy, the serious, what we would call serious works of Eudoxus and Hipparchus and the others were very little known in Rome, very little. At the same time, however, a work, again in verse, by the Greek popularizer Aratus, who was 3rd century BC, entitled The Phenomena, was the most popular work on astronomy and weather prognostication in Rome. In fact, it was translated into Latin at least 5 times, at least 4 times, I should say. Perhaps more. We know of at least 4 translations of it, separate translations. What you might want to compare this to is the work by the Roman poet Virgil, the Georgics, on agriculture. Now, if you're a farmer, or you want to be a farmer, you don't sit down and read Virgil's Georgics and then go out and buy a farm and become an agriculturalist. It's some way for leisured people to understand something about the world around them, the trades, or various sorts of things. They're intended to be entertainment. They're not intended to be teaching texts. There's also one reason why all of these things that I've just mentioned to you are in verse. There's a matter of taste involved here, of aesthetic taste, not necessarily of learning more about natural philosophy itself. Well, this popularizing trend produced a new genre of writing for the Romans, the encyclopedia. Now, don't think about this as the Encyclopedia Britannica with so many volumes in alphabetical order with little articles written on various topics. The encyclopedic works were works that were intended to be read to give an overview of the state of knowledge in a field or in all fields. what you have to know to be an educated, cultured, upper middle class, upper class Roman. They were well adapted to amateur readers. They tended to be entertaining, not too heavy, sort of light reading. For the history of science, the most important such work was written by Pliny the Elder, entitled the Historia Naturalis. Now, Pliny is an interesting character in and of himself. He was born in 23 AD, and he died on the 24th of August, AD 79. Well, we certainly know his date of death very carefully, down to the day, in fact, down to the hour. Why? Well, the year 79 AD may strike a memory with some of you. It's the year of the eruption of Vesuvius that buried Herculaneum in Pompeii. In fact, Pliny the Elder was killed in the eruption. He happened to be on a ship nearby, near the Bay of Naples, when the volcanic eruption started. He went to get a better look and was killed by the poisonous, toxic gases from the volcano. Of his 8 known works, only the Historia Naturalis survives. And it's a huge work. It was completed in 77 AD, composed of 37 books. It deals with astronomy, geography, zoology, botany, medicine, mineralogy, metallurgy, technical subjects, all kinds of things, in a plain and often very entertaining style. It's filled with accounts of monstrous races of humans, ones that have one leg that they hop around on, or one eye, or all kinds of bizarre things. It contains anecdotes, stories, and observations. Pliny's text includes borrowings from many acknowledged sources, like Aristotle, Theophrastus, Eudoxus, all the rest of them, many of which are now lost in the original. In fact, the first book of the Historia Naturalis is basically a table of contents. It says what is in each book and the authorities he used. In fact, he read over 2,000 books, he says, in order to collect his information. If we look at the list of names, there are some people in there we know nothing about. We would have never heard of them if it hadn't been for Pliny recording their name there. Well, Pliny often moralizes as well while he's recounting natural philosophical information. It's not, remember, predominantly a scientific text. It's for the leisure classes to read, and so moralizing is part of what Pliny does. Pliny chides his fellow Romans frequently for luxury and superficiality. Well, let me just give you a few examples of Pliny. You'll be kind of surprised of some of the things that are in Pliny. In one case, he recounts the Greek studies of meteorology, and in doing so, he points out one of the points that I've been trying to make about the difference between the Romans and the Greeks. He says, more than 20 old Greek authors put forth their observations in these matters. And I'm amazed at this all the more because then the world was in chaos, chopped up into many kingdoms. Yet, so many men were still busied on so difficult a study, even amid wars. Now, we live amid peace, under a ruler who rejoices in the advancement of the arts and the letters. And nothing at all is learned by means of new investigations. In fact, not even the discoveries made previously are being taught. So Pliny's wagging his finger, in a sense, at his fellow Romans, for one, not even learning Greek natural philosophy correctly, and for not advancing it anymore. He moralizes, for example, on when he talks about Tyrian purple, the dye made from the murex shell, which was used to dye a purple stripe on the togas of high-class individuals, upper-class individuals. Of course, purple also used for the emperor. Here's another example. The ostrich of Africa is the largest of birds. It is taller and faster than a man on horseback, and it has wings only to assist it in running, for it is not a flying creature and cannot take off from the earth. It has talons like the hooves of a deer, which it uses as weapons. That's true enough. It can grasp stones, which it can then throw when being pursued by pursuers. Another thing he says about the ostrich is that it's incredibly stupid because it thinks it can hide itself by sticking its head into a bush so that it can't see. We're all familiar with that. Did you ever think it actually came to to us through Pliny. In fact, a lot of our ideas, our folkloric ideas about animals, are actually from Pliny. If you think back to the things you learned as children, sort of uncritically about animals, you'll find them in Pliny. For example, when he talks about the elephant, it has a prodigious memory and it's afraid of mice. Now, besides these amusing bits, Pliny does transmit some important things on to later generations. For example, the size of the Earth calculated by Eratosthenes, and numerous other things. I would suggest that it's a very readable text. There are readable edited translations now. I would suggest to you you would find it an amusing thing to read. You can flip through it, go take a nice warm bath, and curl up like a Roman with a copy of Pliny. You'll find it enjoyable reading. Well, the important thing, I think, for the Historia Naturalis is that it was not a work that was ever lost. It was transmitted to the Latin Middle Ages, something we're going to have to talk about in the next lecture, and it became a major source for natural knowledge throughout the Middle Ages. Fine. Well, after having gone through something about these encyclopedic works, I need to say a little something in my last few minutes about Roman education. At the time of the Roman Empire, there were many Greek schools available, espousing different philosophies, different approaches, different kinds of things to be taught, as were Greek tutors. If you were a wealthy Roman, you would have a Greek tutor, presumably a slave, to teach your children Greek and Greek philosophy. Being bilingual was an important part of being an upper-class Roman in the heyday of the empire. Very much the same way that in the 19th century, it was considered an important accoutrement for young ladies and gentlemen in the English-speaking world to know some French. Same way with Greek for the Romans. Again, it was a matter of taste and social status. The Romans did develop a new kind of schooling, however, with a more standardized, I want to be very careful about using that word, but a relatively more standardized curriculum. These schools were frequently attended by the children of people in the urban middle classes, upper middle classes, people who maybe couldn't afford a private live-in tutor slave. There would be a school that they could send their children to. The basis of the Roman educational system was borrowed again from late Hellenistic educational systems. The basis of the Roman education, at least towards the end of the empire, centered around what came to be called the 7 liberal arts, the artes liberales. They are liberal, free, because they are not tied to practical concerns immediately. They are not craft skills. They are free skills. The enunciation of these 7 are actually chosen out of a list of 9 that were put together by the Roman writer Varro in the 1st century BC. He considered these 9 subjects as the suitable subjects for aristocratic Roman gentlemen. He included medicine and architecture in his list, which are not now considered part of the liberal arts. They were banished from the status of the liberal arts by the end of the empire, certainly throughout the Middle Ages. Those 2 topics, medicine and architecture, are too closely allied to craft traditions. Their practitioners don't have the same status, the same high status as people who know the liberal arts, the gentlemanly arts. Well, the 7 liberal arts are divided into 2 groups. First group are predominantly verbal: rhetoric, grammar, and dialectic, or logic. That was the first course of study. By the end of the empire, these 3 came to be known as the trivium, which literally means the 3 roads to wisdom, 3 roads to knowledge, or the 3-lane highway, perhaps, in modern parlance. By the way, though, words also evolve, and the word trivium gives us the basis for our word trivial, because these 3 things, everybody knew them. It was nothing you could boast about, just like today you can't go out and have an impressive resume by saying, well, I can read and write. Well, those are trivial accomplishments. Everybody has them. They're the basis of learning. And the same was true throughout the Roman period and the Middle Ages, so eventually trivium developed into trivial. Not to say that they're unimportant, but they're the basis. The other four liberal arts are the mathematical arts, mathematical as defined by Pythagoras. And they are arithmetic and geometry, astronomy, and this one may surprise you, music. Well, it shouldn't surprise you if you listen to what I had to say about Pythagoras and the importance of music and harmony in the mathematical life of the Pythagorean school. They constitute a second group, namely the quadrivium, the four roads. The real innovation of the Romans themselves came in what we might call higher or professional schools. The first of these was law schools. That's a development of the Roman period. Roman law, of course, is highly advanced. It forms a basis of later Western law. It certainly forms a basis of our own legal system, along with English common law. It's no accident that if you go to Washington, D.C., and you look at the Supreme Court, it's a Roman temple. In the 4th century, a second professional school was added, that of medicine. And Roman medicine actually developed to quite a high degree. We haven't talked about medicine very much, but the Greek writer Galen, who lived in the 2nd century A.D., lived in Rome for a long period of time, wrote extremely influential, extremely important, extremely long-lived texts on medicine. They were, along with the writings of the earlier Greek Hippocrates, the basic texts for medical education, medical studies, down to the end of the Middle Ages, certainly down to the 17th century. Later, in the Middle Ages, particularly after the rise of Christianity, or particularly on account of the rise of Christianity, I should say, a third higher faculty, higher degree was added, that of theology, the highest level of all in the medieval university. We'll have plenty of time to talk about the medieval university in due course. What I can say for now is that the late imperial Roman educational system formed the basis, the pattern for schools for the next 1,000 years. And some traces of this Roman organization survive today. We still divide, for example, standardized tests into verbal and mathematical, the trivium and the quadrivium. Well, in sum, the Romans valued a smattering of Greek natural philosophical knowledge, not at a deep level, but rather at a fairly dilettantish level. Dilettantish is probably not a fair word, but the point is that the knowledge of Greek natural philosophy was considered an accoutrement of civility, an accoutrement of the proper aristocratic class, like the knowledge of Greek, the knowledge of of being bilingual in Latin and in Greek if you were a member of the right set, a member of the right class. In any case, of course, there are never very many members total of a society who devote themselves to the cutting edge of knowledge. Even in the Greek world, the Greeks passed on to us, onto the Romans, of sophisticated natural philosophy, but again, there wasn't a large proportion of the Greek population that actually was doing that. It was a very small number. But the fact remains that in the Roman world, we still can't point even to that small number, that small proportion of the overall population. We cannot point either to any Roman authors who made substantive developments over Greek thought, the legacy of Greek thought, in the area of natural philosophy. Now, this has important consequences because this relative lack of substantive interest in Greek natural philosophy meant that when the end of the classical era came about, the Romans could transmit to their heirs, that is, to the early Middle Ages, only what they themselves possessed. And that was not much more than a smattering of Greek natural philosophy at a low level in a very popularized form.